Finally, there was a question about the disability bill, because there are about 25 million people thought to live with some form of disability in Nigeria, and people are interested in knowing what this government is going to do about improving their situation. Yes, sir. So maybe we start with the Almajiri with Mr. President.
Yes, well, the Almajiri case, I think we have to look at the 3 tiers of government responsibilities: the federal, the state, and the local governments, and the allocation of resources, revenue allocation formula, and so on, relative to the resources available to the country. Monies are dispensed to that 3-tier government system. So the question of Almajiri's case, this lack of virtually primary, the basic education, are all local government problems. So even if the center has extra money, they wouldn't take it and build classrooms, equip them, employ qualified teachers from the federal revenue, while it is the duty of the local governments. If the local governments are not being given the money by the governors or by the state, then it's up to the local governments to come together and scream loud enough for Nigerians to hear them, so that there will be proper allocation of resources by the constitutional means.
Mr. President,
that's for the Almajiris.
Yes, sir. Let me just ask a little follow-up questions regarding that. Part of the frustrations that some people have with the way Nigeria is structured is that we seem to have sometimes confusion. So technically, we'd sort of say something like primary education resides with local government, but then you have agencies like the Universal Basic Education Agency, which is a federal agency and which has some role to play in primary education. And part of this confusion is why people will say, for example, we need to restructure and move some things from exclusive list, from concurrent list to the residual list. What are your thoughts regarding restructuring, particularly in relation to education?
Well, my thought is that firstly, there must be a lot of education. And this I recommend should be led by the press to expose what the relationship, how effective the governments are dispensing to local governments monies, from the center. If that is not done, then it is very difficult for the federal government under this dispensation to enforce education at all levels by the respective states, either the state, the local governments, or the center itself. I will give, I think, some examples of this. In some of the investigations, it was uncovered that local government chairmen were made to sign for the money that are supposed to be their allocation, but they will only be given about 25% of the money. The rest will be taken by the governor. There are investigations in some of the states that are showing that. So I am expecting the press, on behalf of the people, to make an in-depth investigation and expose corrupt governors, and local government chairmen.
Thank you, sir. Would you be willing to re-examine the UBEC funds? Because those reside with the federal government, and yet they are actually meant for primary education. So they are normally disbursed, I believe, by the federal government.
Well, I think what has happened so far, anyway, with the UBEC, I think there are agencies of government, federal agencies, that in some senses support support local government and states. But the bulk I mean, clearly, primary education, as Mr. President has said, lies squarely in the hands of local governments and all of that. But I think with UBEC, what happened with UBEC is that UBEC has an arrangement where they say if the state, if there's 20 million for a state, they'll say, well, the state should bring its own counterpart funding of a certain amount of money. It could be 20% or 25%. Now, that percentage is what the states ought to bring to the table before they have access to the UBEC fund. Most states never accessed the UBEC funds. They simply said they didn't have the counterpart funding. But what has happened?
Don't you find that problematic, though?
Excuse me. What has happened now? What has happened now is that from the Paris Club reforms that was given to the states, the federal government now paid off all of their counterpart funding. So all states can now access UBEC funds without any hindrance whatsoever.
Okay. Now, the other questions are to do with disability and with the livestock plan. Yes. The livestock plan, I think...
The disability?
Yeah, okay, we'll start with disability. Yes, Mr. President.
Well, I honestly cannot remember the plan being taken to the National Assembly and how much they have commented on it and sent it back to the center. It's the same thing with the disability bill. There are so much with the National Assembly. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, I expect, honestly, the elite, the press through the elite, to keep an eye on the activities, on the bills between the executive and the National Assembly. If the executive send a bill, they can hardly put it in the budget unless it is returned from the National Assembly with their comments or with their recommendations.
So we will find out what's happening with that bill with the National Assembly, and then maybe
But a lot of time has been wasted.
Right. Okay, Mr. President. Now, I'd like to do a little follow-up question regarding this livestock, because we got a question from a listener, and I'll try and dig up their name, where they were asking, how do you intend to bring a permanent stop to the difficulties and the conflict going on between farmers and herdsmen?
I don't answer the question.
No.
Yeah, so the conflict...
Raise your voice.
The conflict between farmers
and
herders. Yes, and herders.
Well, what happened started from Benue State was unfortunate. And we foresaw that. When I say we, I mean the federal government. And we asked the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development to go to the archives and find out the gazettes from the First Republic where those incredible leadership of the First Republic, there was cattle route, there was grazing areas. With limited resources, they put windmills, earth dams, and even veterinary clinics. But subsequent very important personalities encroached on the cattle routes, on the grazing areas. And if a herder has 200 cattle, they have just eaten, whichever their way to the water port, they will just go through there. And I think the Minister of Agriculture and Water Resources have produced the maps, the encroachment.
But these are old maps, and this is today's problem. So we might have had a solution to this many years ago in the 60s with the routes and everything, but clearly that solution is no longer tenable now. And so the issue is, these are urgent problems that we're facing now. People are dying, people are getting killed, conflict is breaking out. What are we going to do about it? like now?
What we are doing about, we have already started, and we have to ask, especially the governors. The movement is from north to south, and it's quite predictable. After the harvest, you know, the cattle have to move southward for water and pasture. And then our borders, for example, between Lake Chad and Benin Republic, about 1,400 kilometers with Niger alone. And look at the Cameroon's one. And to effectively survey that border, when structures were tampered with in terms of cattle routes and grazing areas, it is very difficult. We have sent this in back through the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development to the governors so that we can create these corridors. But for a government like Benue government, when they said they have banned cattle rearing or they have banned grazing, we are in the same country. I expect our government to insist on the routes to be re-established in the grazing areas. But to say that cattle cannot move, it's very difficult. Benue is complaining, but I understand they are already in Bielsa. From there, are they going into the Atlantic?
Okay, Mr. President, yeah, but can I just quickly, because you know,
let me add a comment to that. Part of what, because when the matter was referred to the governors, I chaired the committee, the National Economic Council, and part of the plan that the National Economic Council laid out was called the Livestock Transformation Plan. All of the governors in the so-called frontline states were also involved in this. And I think that one of the very important points that emerged from the discussions at the National Economic Council was the fact that there was a need to ensure that we were able to create some access to places, to grazing areas. And I think that that's the point also that Mr. President is making, that in order to be, for instance, anywhere where cattle are, you must still have some kind of access, so that you then have an area where it could be a ranch, it could just be a place where you have earth dams, it could be a place where you just have water, where, you know, whatever it is. And we then agreed with the governors that because federal government has no land, only state governments have land. We then agreed with the state governments that, okay, anyone that is willing, you will put together the resources. If private people want to put together the resources, they can build those areas. They could be called ranches or grazing areas, whatever you call them. And people will pay appropriate fees. The cattle rearers will pay appropriate fees, use the facilities, and go back whenever they want to go back. Because clearly, somebody has to bring those cattle to that point. And we tried to say that that was an interim phase, because as time goes on, you will eventually be able to stop grazing from one point to the other. But that will take time.
Yeah, well, so the point is basically Mr. President himself owes, you know, cattle. Everybody knows. He's very proud of his cows in Daura and talks about them all the time. But the perception is that he, Mr. President is a little bit biased because these are his people that are involved, and that instead of facing the fact that in the 21st century there's really no room for the cattle rearing in the way we're doing it and coming up with modern ways of cattle rearing, we're trying to hold on to an old-fashioned way of rearing meat.
No, but you pointed out already. Let me be Mr. President's counsel. You pointed out already that he has his cattle in a ranch, in a farm. You know, I don't think that's old-fashioned. That I think is that is current. That you have your somewhere. But I think that the matter really is one, as I said, that is within the province of the National Economic Council. And that's why the governors took it up. Because the federal government cannot determine what will happen in any state, because the states themselves pass laws on their land and the use of their land. We don't have land except federal land. So there's really no way that we can do much with that. And that's why we decided to hold the National Economic Council meetings, set up a committee on the Livestock Transformation Plan, and we're working with the state governments. And many of the state governments have given land for purposes of ranching. They've given land for as grazing areas. We are building earth dams in many of the different states. And I'm the chairman of that particular committee.
Now, the thing is this, though. When you think in terms of the problem that farmers and herders are going through, it's a problem that goes beyond the right of way, because obviously there's issues around climate change. And I am still a little bit confused about what the government policy is that underpins, you know, the way we deal with issues around climate, which are sort of the long-term things that you must look at if you have to come up with a solution that is going to last.
I think that is precisely the point that is being made. That let me explain, perhaps I need to go into a bit more detail about the work of the National Economic Council on this livestock transformation plan. As I said, the reason why we had to constitute the governors where we had to constitute ourselves into a committee was precisely because we recognized that the reason why we have all these clashes between herdsmen and farmers is because of desertification. It's because of all of the conflicts over pasture and water. A lot of that is climate change related. Now, every state controls territory. Every state controls land. And under the Land Use Act, it is the state governor that has absolute control over the land of his state. It is the state governor that gives you permission, even the federal government. Whatever you want to do on their land, they must give you development control permit, even if it's on federal land, if you have any land that's federal. Now, that's why we sat with the state governors, and we decided that, look, this is an issue that's almost seasonal, and it's getting worse now because of desertification. Now there's some, especially coming from the Sahel.
So I guess the question I was trying to ask was whether there's a policy around desertification and climate change and what the government is doing to mitigate these things.
Of course. Of course, clearly there is. And one of the major policies is what is called the Green Wall Project. We have the Green Wall Project, basically to control desertification coming from the Sahel. The Ministry of Environment has been working on that for years. Now, the other issue, of course, is that we're also cooperating with our neighbors on desertification issues. That's our neighbors in the northern part in North Africa. We're also cooperating with northern part of West Africa, Niger, Chad, etc. And then there's also the project to recharge the Lake Chad, because that's one of the very important projects. And Mr. President is the one who particularly pushed the Lake Chad project, to recharge it, because, as you know, the Lake Chad has almost completely shrunk from about 35,000 square meters to about 1,300 or so square meters. So we need to recharge the Lake Chad from the Congo Basin, and that's one of the projects.
Okay, before we go for a break, I want you to just quickly clarify for me, what is the federal government policy therefore when it comes to mitigating this conflict? Is it to have ranches, or is it to continue having these grazing corridors? Is it a mixture of the two?
For now, what we have is a mixture. What we have is a mixture now, but ultimately, what the governors are saying, in their respective states, they will provide for those who want to do the business of ranching sufficient space to do so. In the interim, they are building earth dams so that cattle coming from the north, especially going towards the river banks. And you find that a lot of these conflicts are in those areas, are able to, even before they get anywhere near there, are able to access earth dams, water from the earth dams, access veterinary care, and all of that. So the long-term plan, of course, is to eventually create ranches, but ranches have to be privately owned. Government cannot create ranches. But at the moment, you can't just suddenly one day say, no more grazing, that's the end of it. Immediately, that doesn't happen anywhere. And in all of the places where the problem has been solved, because the Governor's Council, that committee, we studied it very carefully. We looked at everywhere where the problem has been solved. It was a gradual process. It's that same gradual process that we're going through.
Okay, we will take a quick break. Don't go away.